Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about a topic that is cause for concern among management teams across the country, really across the world, and that is cloud security. Certainly a topic that many companies are still trying to figure out. To provide insight into that, I'm joined by two experts today. With me is Dave Dufour, Vice President of Engineering and Cybersecurity at Carbonite and Webright. Hello to you, Dave.
Hi, how you doing?
Good, and I'm glad you're with us today. Dave, where are you located today?
Well, I live in Denver, Colorado, but right now I happen to be sitting in Winter Park, Colorado, because I wanted to get up to the mountains.
You're gonna ski later today?
No, to be fair, I'm actually touring around skateboarding. I'm a big skateboarder, and there's a lot of skate parks, so that's what I'm doing.
Cool. Okay. Also with me is Jamie Zajac, Vice President of Product Management at Carbonite and Webright. Hello to you, Jamie.
Hey, James. How's it going?
Good. And now, Jamie, where are you located today?
So I'm in Boston, not nearly as close to the mountains as Dave, but
right.
Super jealous right now.
and are you going to be skateboarding later on today?
Not unless I want to end up in the hospital tonight. Unlikely there.
That would be the same with me. I don't think I could get on a skateboard at this point. I mean, it'd be like taking my life in my hands. All right, so let's talk about cloud security. I know we want to drill down into Endpoint. But I'd like to get sort of the overall global view, the two of your sense of what's going on with the overall, cloud security picture. There was a time when people said, oh, we can't use the cloud because the cloud's not secure. And of course that's changed. And it seems to me, correct me if I'm wrong, that the cloud is almost more secure than on-premise these days, in that I haven't heard of, say, Azure or Google or, AWS doing a data breach. But of course, most every data center in America has had a breach. Am I correct in thinking the cloud is actually safer than on-prem these days? Jamie, what's your view on that?
So I think that we really have to think about how people approach the different environments. What I found is that when people are using clouds like Azure or AWS, they tend to implement more modern code, more modern practices, using platform as a service components, using tooling that's specific for that environment. You can use a lot of those same tools or comparable on-prem and a lot of good practices. So I don't look at it as more as which one is inherently more or less secure, but I think that people need to understand the practices that they're taking in either environment and the tools, and then make sure that they're appropriate and up to the job that they're trying to ask that tool to do for them.
Okay. Dave, what's your take? Are you thinking, in the sense, like cloud is actually more secure than the data center, or am I just sort of out on a limb with that one?
Well, I tend to be a pessimist in general on security. I completely agree that right now cloud potentially is more secure depending on the infrastructure. But security's, like a shark, stops swimming, it dies. And so I think from an engineering perspective, give the cyber criminals some time, and I think we'll see some breaches in some areas that, I guarantee you they're out there poking around, looking for ways in, and there are very good processes in place, as Jamie's pointed out, in ways of protecting. But I promise you, the cyber criminals are trying to figure out how to get in, and we'll see some things happen, in the future. Nothing to be scared about. Like I said, it's always a moving target. But I do think part of the reason that it hasn't happened is we just haven't had that time in the environment long enough where we either become complacent or they figure out ways to breach.
Yeah, speaking of which, I mean, the shark analogy, and I was listening to a talk by an executive at a major American bank, and he said that the bank, protects against 3,000 attacks. Was it a day or a week? I honestly don't remember. It's like, even there's 3,000 a week. That's like, it's basically a constant, series of attacks. Pretty amazing. Jamie, what is your sense on endpoint security? I mean, how has that changed? How has that evolved as cloud has matured, and what role is that playing today?
So I think endpoint security has benefited from the hyperscale of the cloud. That this has really allowed the transformation from signature-based files, or signature-based detections, to using the power of machine learning, of AI, of the hyperscale clouds, to do that and to make it accessible to fundamentally every business and every consumer at this point. So I think that's really been power. I think the other big trend, and maybe we'll get to this too, is devices being connected directly to the cloud versus an on-premise network. And we've seen that trend over many years, and we've obviously seen it accelerate this year due to factors that we all are aware of. And
Right.
so I think having the cloud be available and having endpoints get their intelligence from the cloud helps those devices be more protected than they could have been, say, 3 or 5 years ago, or definitely 10 years ago.
And why is that? Maybe we'll get to that later, but if it says we're right here, is that why is it more secure for those devices to be attached to the cloud as opposed to an on-prem platform?
So I think they can get more up-to-date information. So in an on-prem network, a lot of times, if you look at traditional signature-based, security, you get updates once a week, once a month. Cyber criminals change their style. I mean, 94% of all malware out there is polymorphic at this point. So it's always changing. So, those techniques are just, from a protection, are just outdated. You have to be relying on truly up-to-date information that you can get directly from a cloud in real time.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Dave, your sense of endpoint security, how has that evolved, and how is the cloud moving that forward?
Well, and so completely agree with Jamie. We have a cloud first, vision on our security, because it's just so much quicker and easier. We see a 0 day, we maybe capture it on one endpoint. We're able to update the entire, base that we're trying to protect simply by making that change up in the cloud. Now, one thing that's interesting with the pandemic, people working from home, is we've seen a huge uptick in the use of endpoint security, where people maybe at home had let stuff lapse. Now, all of a sudden, they're that perimeter defense, and the IT departments can no longer lock down the office. And I know everybody thought, work from home, work remote, but really large corporations had still been thinking of that castle moat infrastructure, and then boom, overnight, everybody had to work from home. So I think a lot of what we thought about endpoint security, and that people needed at home, people are using it, I think all of a sudden it was forced on us in a way that maybe surprised us. So honestly, I think everything we've been talking about for 5-6 years, all of a sudden went into effect across the board. So we've seen a huge uptick in the necessity as mom or dad became not only IT support for the house, but also corporate IT support, because they're all at home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an amazing topic, the idea of how the pandemic has affected technology. I mean, Jamie, what do you see? I mean, obviously, I think it's accelerated the move to the cloud, but I guess as Dave points out, the idea of endpoint security has really been pushed to the forefront by the pandemic. What do you see there?
Yeah, so the endpoint is the new edge. There is no edge to the corporate network anymore. One of the big things too is a lot of people are susceptible not just to malware and file-based threats, but a lot of web threats and phishing attacks. So phishing attacks are usually I think they're the number one most successful technique used to have a successful breach. Social engineering, going after humans, and I think in the pandemic, what I've noticed is the level of distraction that employees now have when they're trying to work, they're trying to babysit, they're trying to teach their children, they're doing laundry, all these things. Right. It makes it harder for you to be vigilant in what emails you're getting and what links you're clicking. So that's been a huge uptick, and making sure, from a security perspective, that you're aware of that and that you have protections in place, since you can't rely on the corporate firewall anymore to play a significant role in that.
On that same note, I got an email from a Nigerian prince, and he's telling, and it's really good news, because all I have to do is send him my bank information. Apparently, it's like $500,000 he can send me. So it's like, this will be probably my last day in the job. It's pretty good. So I'm really happy, looking forward to that.
Yeah, if you want to send me your bank information afterwards, I can help out too.
I totally appreciate that. But if I could follow up that, Jamie, has there been this sort of tightening security in the last 6-7 months, or is it like companies realizing, oh my gosh, we're out of control and we're still struggling to get it back under control?
I think a lot of it depends. Companies break down into a couple of categories. If a company was relying on, as Dave called it, the castle and moat protection, they've really struggled. They've had to really adapt their tool set quickly. If the company had already been using, next-gen cloud-based tools, then maybe they still had to up the speed of deployment or up the skills of their analysis, but they at least had a stronger foundation to build off of. So companies, depending on kind of where they were pre-COVID, everyone's had some struggles and some changes, but I think that really triggered how much challenge they've had.
Right. Dave, what would you add about the pandemic and security? It seems like there's no more hotter topic than that.
Well, a couple of things, like to pile on with the phishing that Jamie pointed out, that is so bad right now. And with the distractions, we're seeing a huge uptick in the number of emails people are getting. We saw over a 34% increase in emails year over year from 2019 to 2020.
Is that because the cyber criminals realize? I'm sorry, just a quick one. Is that because the cyber criminals realize people are more distracted? Why has there been the uptick this year?
Well, the uptick in email is just everybody's now working from home, so there's more emails, and then now they're focusing then on things like COVID. We've seen a massive increase in emails around, getting your check from the government. Hey, fill this out. There's a stimulus check coming. Give us your information. We can get you that check faster. So there's a lot of stuff that's really playing on COVID, and people are just really having to pay attention. And that distraction factor that Jamie brought up has been huge, where people just are trying to do too much. They're clicking through stuff. Their boss, they see an email, it says urgent, they click on it, and maybe it's not the right thing. So people really do need to pay attention. And that said, I think corporations are realizing that training and making sure people know what to do if there's a threat, know how to identify a phishing email. This is all becoming more and more critical as we rely on the individual to be the responsible person. So training is also starting to factor into this, and businesses are starting to realize we need to put money into that.
Right. Dave, you touched on this a little bit. I guess I would ask you, Jamie, how important it is for workforces to understand the importance of endpoint security. Are the folks in the field or the managers understanding that?
So, I think everyone's always looked at cybersecurity as the job of the IT department or of the security team, right? It's IT's job to keep me protected, to keep my business protected. Mm-hmm. I think that's wrong. You could argue it always was, but it definitely is now, that security is everyone's job. Right. Whether it's not clicking on links, whether it's, making sure that you're running the right tooling on your thing, to physical security, right? Making sure someone's not tailgating you into the office. So I think it's kind of this cultural change that security isn't IT's job, but security is everyone's job. That's kind of the shift that needs to be made to be successful.
I'm keeping myself secure. I put my password on a little sticky note and I put it right on my computer so I don't forget it that way. It seems like it's a very secure. Is that a very secure way to do my password?
Hey, as long as you don't put the username and password together, it's better than nothing, I guess.
Well, and I'll be honest, I'd rather you did it on a sticky than you put it on your computer in like a text document that I could get to and see. Like the sticky is better than that.
Right. I guess, and I will ask this sincerely then in this case. Actually, there are a series of really sensitive passwords that I have written down on paper, and I put in a folder, off the computer because I'm thinking, I can't even have these passwords on my computer at all. Is that paranoia or is that a justifiable thing to be doing?
Look, I think it's justifiable. I am just as paranoid, and I use pen and paper. Obviously, physical security, somebody could break into my house and steal it, but the odds of that happening are much slimmer than somebody, scraping every file on my computer and then finding my password and user ID together in an Excel document. Uh-huh.
Jamie, maybe I should even, are you writing down your passwords? Or do you keep them on your, don't answer that question if it's too personal. I don't, we'll skip that.
I've still got a nice good brain up here for
good. Okay. I guess that is the ultimate safety, is like, it's not even written down, it's in your brain. That's impressive. Yes. Okay. Well, you're one past me on that one. I don't think I could remember them,
You'll catch up with me someday. Don't worry.
Cloud security safeguards. How do we keep things safe? Critical systems, intellectual property, and data safe from cyber threats. I guess it's sort of a best practices question. Jamie, what would you say to people in terms of some best practices for endpoint security, for cybersecurity in the cloud? What advice?
Yeah, so I think sometimes people fool themselves into thinking that there's a silver bullet, that there's a single tool that if they buy or they implement, that they're protected. Mm-hmm. You've really got to kind of do a proper assessment of understanding where is what data do you have, where is it, who has access to it, and how are you protecting it? And I think if you really kind of ask some of those key questions for every application that you're running, for every server that you're running, whether it's a SaaS application, whether it's on-premise, whether it's running in a public cloud, if you know what you have, who has access to it, and how you're securing it, you'll probably scare yourself into making some different decisions because you'll realize that by default, you didn't use the best practices, or by default, something was wide open, or more open than you wanted it to be. So I think you really start with those kind of key questions and do a self-assessment. The other thing is, I don't think everyone needs to aim for being perfect on every application, all the time. You've got to look at what is the sensitivity of the data that you have, what are the different vectors, and just kind of keep working on getting better. If you're continuously adding more more protection, whether it's procedural-based, tooling-based, automation, that's a good approach. Don't have to be perfect with everything, but get better every month, every quarter, every year with what you have.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned the word automation. This might be off topic, but I think it's interesting. Let me know if you can address it, or it's just not what you think about that much. I bet it is. In terms of automation and security, seems like those two things can go together. Are there a lot of companies just saying, hey, we want to automate this whole process? And is that good, or is it like, oh goodness, once it's automated, then there's problems?
No, I mean, I think automation is key, because if you're relying on humans make errors. Right. We talked about them being distracted. That's really common. So the more you can automate and put into templates and make rinse and repeatable, the higher compliance you're going to have. And then also sometimes you'll have a centralized place or a few centralized locations to make improvements. So if you change your password policy, or you change your two-factor authentication, or the way that you're managing least privileged accounts, maybe you can do that in 2 or 3 systems as opposed to 24, where you're going to have higher compliance with that. You'll get benefit from those changes faster.
Mm-hmm. Dave, what would you say in terms of best practices, cloud security, endpoint security? What would you say advise companies?
Well, so one thing, obviously, endpoints, make sure you've got a good solution. Maybe you have good DNS solutions, things of that nature. All of those are important, but something that is critical that we haven't even spoke about here, depending on the type of attack you're experiencing, a data breach is one thing, but most places nowadays are experiencing a lot of ransomware issues, simply because ransomware, people can make money. And the number one way to protect yourself there is to make sure you've got good backups. Backup is a cornerstone to actual cybersecurity. And it's just something that we all need to be aware of. We need to take care of, and we need to ensure that if there is something that we're doing in terms of having good endpoint security, we're applying good updates. If we don't have good backups, and a backup is a process. You got to back up and you got to restore. If you can't restore it, the backup's worthless. So backup is something that people need to not overlook.
You're saying if they have a backup, they can ignore the ransomware threat?
You can ignore it quite a bit, actually, because if you have the ability to restore and recover from that, then potentially, that's something that you can step away from and not pay that ransom. Now, you do need to be able to restore, and you need to have a process for restoring in a reasonable amount of time. Because if the cost of restoring is going to take more time than if you just simply paid the ransom, then you might as well pay the ransom, right? I'm not saying pay ransoms.
Right.
There, but you know what I'm trying to say.
Yep. Let's look. I mean, as kind of a wrap up, I think it'd be interesting to look to the future of endpoint security and cloud security. If we're having the same conversation, say, 2 or 3 years from now, I mean, what is our conversation going to look like? And in other words, how can companies be ready for the future of what's coming, say 24 months or 48 months down the road? Jamie, what do you see if you look in your crystal ball?
Yeah, so my crystal ball says it's going to be all about the network and the web and the internet traffic. It's not going to be about files. It's going to be about, someone, trying to be nefarious, someone trying to trick you on a website, trying to get in via malicious traffic. I think that's going to be paramount. Protect your network, not just your firewall, your internal network, but inspect it and have a good solution for looking at the traffic on your endpoint devices itself.
Yep.
Yeah, is that on that same note? I mean, they used to say the biggest threat was a rogue employee. Is that still true, or is it the threat is more out there as opposed to in here? Jamie.
It's both. It's definitely both. I mean, rogue employees, an employee who's going to quit, an employee who's been furloughed and not particularly happy about it. If they have the keys to the kingdom, then they can cause a lot of harm. And that's why a lot of things like least privileged accounts are always, mentioned as a best practice. You want to lock down how much, badness an employee can do. You have to trust your employees at some level, obviously, to do their job. You've got good checks to hire great people, but you also don't want to trust them too much. You don't want to rely on that as the only element of your security plan. So yeah, it's a real threat, and it should definitely not be ignored.
Dave, what would you say if you're looking to the future? You know, what is endpoint security and cloud security going to look like, you know, 2, 3, 4 years from now?
So I think we'll always have some type of endpoint solution, you know, that'll try to protect us from phishing files and things. But I completely agree with Jamie. We've got to get more to a network-based security posture where we're able to detect threats that are in transit, both file-borne, phishing-borne, but also like, you know, data extraction and things like that. So the network, I really think, will become more and more important because it's going to become nearly impossible to put an endpoint solution on all of the types of mobile devices, all of the IoT devices, just everything. It's just the network is where it's going to be at.
Right. I mean, really, the question is, I mean, it seems like edge computing is coming up. It seems like it doesn't get quite as many headlines as cloud computing, but it seems like edge computing will sort of swallow cloud computing and everything. And edge computing feels like it's a cybersecurity nightmare at a certain point. Is that true or no? It's not a whole new brand of worries.
It's totally true because, you know, I think, you know, we've been around so long. I've been doing this since the 80s where we go do all the work on the client, then do all the work on a mainframe, then do all the work on a server, then do all the work, you know, we shift it. And I think edge computing is going to do that as we push processing ability to that edge. And we have these devices doing work with data. If we're not protecting that, you know, information properly, that's where we're going to see the threats. So I do agree that there'll become a complacency as we lock down the cloud. Wait a minute, now we're back to a castle moat infrastructure around our cloud, but we just pushed computing out to the edge. Now we got to put another endpoint out there in the edge. You know, it's that back and forth.
Jamie, would you agree that I mean, if an executive hears the phrase edge computing, should they think, oh goodness, that's dangerous, or not necessarily?
I don't think they have to think, is it dangerous? But I think they do need to think, you know, how are we going to handle this? And I think this is also going to push forward a good discussion around privacy, you know, both personal and in a work environment. You know, what information is personal to an employee should be kept personal versus it's owned by the company. How is that transmitted? You know, when we look at 5G devices being everywhere, you know, that's going to also bring up you know, I think a really good and interesting debate about security and privacy and how those two interact together.
What's the nutshell on 5G and security and privacy? How do they play together?
Well, so, you know, with things like 5G or even edge computing all over, your data starts going everywhere, tracking your locations. You know, as you're walking down the street, you can get all sorts of information off of someone. Right. So, you know, how much is that expected to be utilized? How is that data kept private? You know, does my employer know where I went out to lunch, and do I want them to know? And is it their right to know? Right. And does, you know, who else knows about that information? But at the same time, you know, the push and pull with privacy is, in order to secure something, you want to know where it is and how it's being used. So you want more information to look for anomalous behavior or malicious behavior. So I think there's always a kind of little bit of tug of war between, you know, privacy and security, and striking the right balance for each individual and each business is going to be a really fun debate.
Right, right. Well, I mean, I think I've run out of reasonable questions. I'm going to start talking about skateboarding again, and we don't want that. So Jamie, Dave, thank you very much for sharing your expertise. I'll send you the link when it's done. Appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Great being here, James.
Great opportunity.
Take care.
Bye.